How does an army learn to learn when it is in contact? We look at British Army doctrine development during the First World War.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 106 of the Principles of War podcast, doctrine development in the British Army in the First World War. We're going to take a short break from the steamy jungles of the Kokoda track for a three-part interview with Dr Robert Lyman. Dr Lyman is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a Research Fellow at the Changing Character of War Centre at the University of Oxford. After a career of 20 years in the British Army, he has published widely on the Second World War in Europe, North Africa and Asia. He's published many books. A couple of my favourites are A War of Empires, Japan, India, Burma and Britain, 1941-45, and Slim, Master of War. Today we're going to be talking about a book that he has written with Lord Dannatt, a previous Chief of the General Staff of the British Army. The book is Victory to Defeat, the British Army 1918-1940. Victory to Defeat, I think, is a very important book. It looks at the way that the British Army learnt, developed doctrine, generated the combined arms effect, and worked with a strategic vision in the First World War. It then studies what happened in the interwar period and how those important lessons were forgotten and needed to be relearned during the Second World War. The lessons in the decline in doctrine, the decrease in capability, and the demise of strategic vision, I think, are important lessons for us today as we look to an uncertain future. So let's get into our interview with Robert Lyman. Welcome to the podcast, Robert.
I'm really pleased to be with you.
With the book, I think there's a lot of really great lessons with it. If we sort of start at the start, one of the key lessons that comes out from the book is that the time required for the National Support Base to build up and to support a defence force during war is quite long. And so in 1914, Britain produced, some of the statistics that you've got in the book are amazing. Britain in 1914 produced us just 91 guns or howitzers, and in 1918 it produced 10,000. This was the first real industrial war, although it could have been envisaged what it would have been like if someone had looked at the US Civil War. So in 1914, Britain was so unprepared for these changes in warfare, both from a technological point of view and industrialisation. Why was that? Why did it take them so long to realise what combat was going to be like?
Two reasons for it, I think. The first is that it's not unusual, and most countries actually suffer from the same problem at the start of war, because the further you move away from the reality and the experience of war, both politically, economically, socially, and militarily, you lose sight of the reality of war. You lose sight of what actually is required to win. We are suffering that problem both in Australia and the West generally, certainly in Britain at the moment. 1914 was no different. The military had rebuilt itself on the experience of the Boer War. And actually, to give it its due, it had done very well. And the British Expeditionary Force, the first BEF that went to France in 1914, was well-equipped, well-trained to fight the last war. It had been rebuilt. Douglas Haig and a number of others had created the field service regulations, so doctrine for the time. And if we were going off to fight a war in South Africa again, we would have done very well. I mean, the South African War, 3.5, 4 years, first couple of years, complete disaster, having to relearn or to learn for the first time the nature of the fighting in which we were engaged. The British Army then transformed itself and proved to be very successful and actually brought about quite a strategic victory in South Africa. I mean, we tend to forget that when we think about Spienkop and a number of the disastrous early engagements. But actually, by the end of the war against the Boers was won. And actually, politically, many of the Boers came across to support the new British political structure in South Africa. I'm wandering a little bit, but it's important to make this point that actually Britain's pretty good at turning around disastrous situations. The military, therefore, in South Africa started badly, ended up pretty well. And just as we talk about 1914, just bear in mind that the First World War only, I say only in inverted commas, took 4 years. The first 2 years really were a rapid recognition by everyone of the reality of the new type of fighting and the new demands that were being made on the United Kingdom. And the last 2 years were effectively a rectification of the problems that we had seen when we first went into battle 1914, 15, and 16 without really understanding what we were facing, which was the massive industrialization of warfare. You are absolutely right to mention the American Civil War, and I've banged on about this in my lectures for many years, but there was quite a dramatic mental closure in Europe to the idea of war in the Americas having anything useful to say. In fact, the late Richard Holmes used to make this point repeatedly, that the European armies looked down on the experience of war in America and didn't think it had anything to teach them. It had an enormous amount to teach them, of course, not least of all the empty battlefield, the need to dig trenches, the problem of achieving maneuver when you're in those situations with massed armies under machine gun fire and artillery fire, of course. Artillery fire in the American Civil War was direct fire rather than indirect. And that was the big transformation in Europe in 1914-15, a massive move from the old horse guns to indirect artillery fire, which became the biggest killer of the First World War. All these things needed to be understood. And it's a very, very interesting reality that, as I said at the start, the further you move away from an experience of the war, of actual war, the more theoretical war becomes, both for the military and for the societies in which we inhabit. And the longer it takes to actually put into place, maybe not the longer it takes, but the higher the mountain to climb becomes when you're facing these new challenges. I mean, I would observe at the start of our conversation that actually the British Army and the Allied armies did pretty jolly well to turn the tide in the First World War. If we see the First World War as being in two parts, of which the fulcrum, of course, is the Somme in July 1916, I mean, the reality is within 2 weeks of the 1st of July 1916, quite a substantial number of really dramatic changes had been forced through into British, Australian and French tactics, which saw the start of a new way of thinking about the attack, for instance. It didn't take much, but sadly, that much included huge cost and blood and treasure. The next thing I'll just quickly touch on is the fact that actually what we were engaging with and didn't really understand in 1914 was that this was a national war. Most of the wars that Britain had experienced in its history before then, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, were expeditionary wars, wars which could be fought elsewhere, involving a professional army and requiring something of the manufacturing capability of the country, but not a national effort. 1914 saw a sudden realization that a national effort was required. In fact, if you know anything about the history of the war, you will realize that, the first government under Asquith was removed in 1915 because of the disastrous failure to produce enough artillery ammunition for the army. And so by 1916, we had Lloyd George, who was effectively a prime minister for the management of the war. And we then had all sorts of political, semi-political and military structures trying to govern the war effort, whilst at the same time, and making it up as they went along, because they'd never done this before. So we had new ministries for munitions and so on being created, trying to corral the national effort. And it did so pretty well, although actually the reality is even by 1918, by the time we come to the 100 days, the British Army was still short of artillery ammunition. One of the ways in which we, the British and the Australians and the Americans and the French indeed managed to survive was by tailoring or changing the way in which artillery was used, rather than the original concept of indirect fire being a battering ram against the enemy mass. So you've got a whole series of things coming up in 1914, first of which is a failure, an understandable failure to really understand what's going to come next. Secondly, you've got the need to create a new army from the basis of the professional army that you have at the moment. The problem being that your current army is based on fighting a war against the Boers in South Africa, with a number of principles, not least of all musketry, that actually hide the need to do other things like create indirect artillery fires, for instance, create better communications on the battlefield, because all of a sudden things are going to move in a way that you really haven't understood in the past. You have to create a new national effort to get the arms, ammunition and men that are required. And across the Empire and Commonwealth in 1916, the war had become a dramatic national effort, which of course is why, or one of the reasons why, it's such an incredibly important part in our social psychology today. Now, the same model it's very interesting when you look at the Second World War, it's almost exactly the same that applied in the Second World War. And this is really at the root of the book that Richard and I, when we sat down to start writing this 2.5 years ago, we said, well, here we have the First World War. We can basically discern a pattern of failure to respond to the new type of fighting, a rapid recognition that something extraordinary is happening and we need to do something about it. We need more troops. We need different types of artillery ammunition and different types of guns. We need new tactics. We're suddenly forced into trenches, which we didn't expect. It removes and destroys maneuver. Actually, the British Army had spent a lot of time studying the American Civil War, but it hadn't applied it to doctrine. That's always the big challenge. Talk about that in a moment with respect to the interwar years. So when you come to the Second World War, almost exactly the same thing happens. We have a period of, blimey, we're back to a new sort of war fighting. We recognize it in part from 1917 and 1918, but it's new because it's fast, it's armored, it's coordinated. We've got aircraft and tanks and infantry moving in various places that have surprised us because our thinking is still quite slow. And we need to mobilize our national economic effort. We need to mobilize our national social effort in order to be able to get troops on the ground, troops trained, and so on. My own personal view here is that the changes that were required in 1939, that we first saw in 1939, and particularly in May 1940 with the German blitzkrieg in northern France and Belgium, weren't actually put into effect until D-Day, 1944. It took that long for the armies of the British Empire and Commonwealth to actually come up to scratch to be able to meet what the people at the time called a first-class enemy, either a first-class or a peer enemy. And that's the same in the Far East, by the way. In 1944, and Infal Kohima, and then the reconquest of Burma, 1945, were all a product of a new army being created in the Far East in 1942-43, in the same way that a new army was created in Europe in 1942-43 to undertake the war in Northwest Europe. And the army that ended up fighting through Italy, slogging through Italy, was actually the legacy army that we had had in 1940 and then gone off to North Africa. So there's a very interesting, I was going to say, concatenation. It's a clash of things coming together that needed solving. Richard and I, when we were writing this book, we sort of mapped this out. We did a couple of days of whiteboarding sessions, and we looked at this and we said, well, okay, that's pretty clear. We had the same pattern of change that we saw in the First World War happening in the Second World War. The big question is, why were we surprised in 1940? Why was the British Army, why was British society taken by surprise? And why did it take so long to get our act together? In fact, when we finished the book, we looked at each other and we said, do you know what? We don't actually believe, this is one of Richard's big drivers, big conclusions rather. In fact, we're going to give another lecture this week to the British Army. And it's quite interesting that he came and said, I don't think Britain actually learnt the lessons of 1940 in 1944. Many of the lessons, there are a number of lessons here about maneuver, about how you actually move in time and space to defeat an enemy. This is not just about moving on the battlefield. It's about thinking about how you achieve an operational objective. He said, I don't think we actually achieved that, probably until the late 1980s. I'll talk about that at the end, because actually in 1942 at El Alamein, what we did to defeat Rommel was basically on his last legs anyway. He had no ammunition left. He had no fuel. But we needed a victory. The way Montgomery achieved that victory was to create effectively a 1917 teed up battlefield, which effectively didn't use maneuver, it just used attritional advance as its leitmotif. That remained the leitmotif of British doctrine until the late 1980s, until Sir Nigel Bagnall introduced a whole series of quite profound changes that were the root of what we all know now as maneuver warfare. So then it's very, very interesting, actually, isn't it? It's we came unprepared as a country and as an army to 1940. And of course, when we started thinking about this, we then started thinking, well, the danger for us nowadays as our army becomes much smaller, as we're losing capability, a little bit like a body. We're going to lose a finger. One year we lose a finger, the next year we lose a couple more fingers. Then we think, well, what's the purpose of a hand without fingers? So let's just chop the hand off. And then we think, well, what's the purpose of having this limb flopping about that doesn't have fingers or a hand? Let's chop the limb off. So we're now left in the British Army, in our view, with not much more than a torso and a brain. And it's a fundamental decline. There is a fundamental decline in capability that's worrying, because the moment you lose the ability, for instance, to operate together in a combined arms way and a fully integrated doctrinal way where your armor, your infantry, your artillery are designed to work together. For instance, Challenger tanks working with AS-90 self-propelled artillery, with Warrior armored vehicles and Apache helicopters. Those four things together are an integrated combat entity supported by sophisticated communications and supported by a doctrine that allows you to maneuver, so you can identify your your operational objective and move your forces accordingly. As soon as you lose any part of that, not only lose capability, but you lose the ability to think about warfighting. And that perhaps is the underlying issue, the underlying conclusion we come to in the book. You need to be able to think about how to use force in a sophisticated way against a first-class enemy. If you could think about how you do it and you've got the capability to deliver it, you've got a very good chance of being successful on the battlefield. But the moment you lose the ability to think about how to warfight, you're completely stuffed. And I think the real tragedy for the British Army in 1940 is that it had forgotten to think. Because it had forgotten to think, it didn't understand what the Germans were doing to it. So this idea of the German, effectively, I'll call them operational maneuver groups because you'll understand what I mean. Effectively the German von Kleist operational maneuver group, so columns of integrated artillery, tanks, infantry and air, although actually as time went on, poor old infantry were left far behind, were a concept that no one in the British Army had considered, despite the fact that actually it was the core of the new thinking that was developing during the 100 Days in 1918. But that new thinking, the new thinking about saying, well, how do we penetrate to the Hindenburg line? How do we break through at a point rather than across a line? How do we reinforce success quickly by bringing artillery and infantry to a point which is where the line's broken? How do we do that? We'd completely forgotten that after 1918, the Germans hadn't, of course. And when we were faced with it on the receiving end of 1940, it was like something we'd never considered. And that's the real challenge. We go on all the time in the book. There's a little bit of repetition, I'm afraid, but we were really keen. Richard, of course, who taught at the Staff College and the Higher Command of Staff College, said, look, Rob, we just need to do the basic stuff. Let's tell them what we're going to tell them, and tell them what we told them. And so we can be forgiven, I think, for a little bit of repetition. But the repetition we make all the time is this point about not thinking. If you think about how to fight, you've got a good chance of being able to do it. And that's the problem with peace. We all love peace. We all want to live in times of peace. I never want to go to war again. I've had enough of it. It's a very stupid thing. But I am convinced that unless we think about how to fight, and unless we then equip our armies to fight against what we think is going to be required, in worst case, it's then an old insurance policy metaphor, we are going to lose the next war. We're going to have real problems surviving an enemy that has starter's advantage. Hitler had starter's advantage in 1940. Hirohito had starter's advantage. Indeed, against Hirohito, we were very lucky because the Japanese actually were pretty inept at war. They were good at fighting, but they were very bad at war. We were very lucky in Europe because Hitler, rather stupidly, his racial policies, turned his eyes east and he went off into Russia. Hitler gave us time in Europe. Hirohito gave everyone time in the Far East. And we were able to, the world, the free world, were able to conquer, ultimately. But if we are facing an enemy in the future where we don't have the luxury of time being granted to us, we've got a real challenge facing us. I had an acquaintance, I won't call him a friend, who, when I sent him a synopsis for the book, he wrote back and he said, I didn't realize you were such a warmonger. And I said, David, what do you mean by warmonger? He said, well, you're advocating rapidly and not rapidly, but certainly significantly increasing the amount of money we spend on the military. And I said, yes, that doesn't mean I'm a warmonger. It means that I take the demands of my insurance policy very, very carefully. I'm not going to pay third-party fire and theft for my defense because I need a fully comprehensive cover. And that's not just about having the capability. It's about having the thinking ability to go with it. If there's one thing that, I just say this finally before, I know I've been banging on, but the one thing that sort of encourages both Richard and I is that actually the British Army does understand the doctrine of manoeuvre. It understands how to operate in these intense environments in a fully intensive way. But the reality is, if we can't train and we can't operate with the equipment and we no longer have the capability, I think, for instance, it's a seriously retrograde step to end up with a fighting force with tracked tanks and wheeled. I'm not even going to call them armored fighting vehicles because the Boxer is not an armored fighting vehicle. It's a battlefield taxi. So long as we have the inability to do that, war fighting becomes an academic exercise. It becomes a theory. It's something that we talk about in our lecture theatres, and it's something I do all the time. It's what I do for a living. It's something we end up putting on our PowerPoint presentations and not actually physically doing. In the British Army, between 1931 and 1940, we had not a single formation exercise. Not a single one.
One point that you've got there that I think is really important is that thinking about how we're going to fight. So technology up until 1914 had made significant changes. Then the rate of innovation increased. So we see the introduction of aircraft and tanks during the First World War. So whilst we're trying to fight a war, we need to learn how to fight that war, which is changing. So how did the British Army in the First World War learn to learn?
It's a fabulous question. We were actually taken by surprise at how good the British Army was. And when I talk about the British Army, I mean the armies of the Empire. It includes Monash's Corps. It includes Curry's Corps as well, the Canadians. The Americans weren't there long enough to be able to get on this learning curve. It's about learning how to learn. And as I said, we were surprised at how good the British Army was, partly because the British command system was, as we describe it, disaggregated. We have the sense that, completely wrong, that Haig at the top of the British Expeditionary Force basically told everyone how to fight and enforced a fighting model on all his corps and armies. That's just not true. It didn't happen. Each of the corps commanders, and to a quite a considerable degree, the divisional commanders themselves were left to design their warfighting methodologies, i.e. how they fought, how they overcame an objective, how they achieved an operational task themselves. And one of the most extraordinary things, I'll just leave ahead now and say this, the British and Empire armies at the end of 1918 were dramatically successful. They managed to beat the German armies in the field. Ludendorff's army was not stabbed in the back, it was stabbed in the front by the British and Empire armies with the Americans and the French, of course. And it was a dramatically successful series of operations that ended the war. Those generals who were responsible for the 100 Days were, on the whole, the same men who were in position in 1916, only 2 years before. So we mustn't forget that. So this donkey's business is exaggerated. And not just exaggerated, but actually it's frankly wrong in many respects. There were a number of generals who weren't up to it. And sadly, many of those stayed in place. But there were sufficient parts of the army that were able to incrementally and bit by bit develop methodologies for solving problems. My go-to army for this is the Fourth Army under Rawlinson, which of course had a British Corps, an Australian Corps under Monash, and the Canadian Corps under Curry, which proved to be astonishingly successful, really by trial and error. And your own Robin Pryor in Australia has done a huge amount to illuminate our understanding of how the army transformed itself between 1916 and 1918. It transformed itself, it did. So to the point that in 1917, we had tanks turning up on the battlefield. No one knew how to use tanks. They were initially used in penny packets. They weren't used in conjunction with infantry. All those lessons about how you might use tanks were learnt the hard way by trial and error, to the extent that by 1918, tanks were being used to bring infantry up, supplies up. There's a wonderful photograph we use in the book of Mark V tanks, because actually we'd built too many tanks to be used in action. We then stripped them out and used them for supply and so on. So the Mark Vs could turn up and fight the battle with infantry who are also accompanied by them in other Mark Vs, so effectively armoured fighting vehicles or elite armoured personnel carriers, so they could keep up with the tanks, and tanks could carry trail guns behind them and so on. So the idea of integration really came through trial and error. And by 1918, it was dramatically achieved. Now, there were systemic answers to your question as well. We had General Ivor Max, who was responsible for training. We didn't really go into that in great detail. We had a publisher's cap of 120,000 words, and a whole series of subjects just didn't make the director's, well, actually, they proved to be the director's cut. They were left on the cutting room floor. But the British Army learnt how to train. Ivor Max was quite a remarkably innovative man, and he set in train a whole series of training schools and training methodologies and the production of pamphlets. That was a really, really critical part of how the army taught itself how to fight, because Max and everyone else, I mean, Hayden knew this as well, recognized that actually in July 1916, the British Army comprised 6 separate armies. It had the old BEF, the old BEF. It had Kitchener's army, which had been recruited en masse in 1915 and had been training for the latter part of 15 and 1916 to go to war. And then it had the new conscript army, which came online in early 1916. These 3 armies had to be pulled together and they needed to be formed into a single army that was designed to fight. And it wasn't ready by July 1916. That whole sense of an integrated army, knowing how to advance to contact, knowing how to overcome heavily defended defensive positions, knowing how to operate between battalions, brigades, and divisions didn't exist. And Ivor Max and the rest of the BEF sat down and got to a huge amount of retraining. It's also important to note retraining and developmental training, maybe not retraining, is developmental training of existing battalion, brigade, and divisional commanders to be able to operate together and to recognize that actually the key thing in achieving a successful battle is achieving your operational objective. What is the operational objective? And it's very interesting when you read the orders for the 100 days crossing the Hindenburg Line, it was to create a break in the Hindenburg Line for the purpose of destroying the army. It wasn't a mass offensive simply to cause the Germans more casualties than the British. When I'm in Burma, by the way, or India, leading tours or doing study days and so on, doing battlefield guiding, I always call them Germans as well. So, if I'm in Europe, I call them Japanese. If I'm in Asia, I call them German. So you need to apologize for that. And I also we talk about the fact that actually learning is not parabolic. It doesn't follow a carefully curated curve. It's very, very bumpy. Some people see the need for it, others don't. But actually, on the whole, the army is changing. The army is getting better. And I think one of the most significant changes that occurred in the British armies and the Allied armies was with artillery. There's no doubt about it. There was a revolution in military affairs. My friend Jonathan Bailey has described this for many, many years in some really, really quite seminal work, describing how artillery played such a dramatically important role in victory in 1918 by delivering fires or fire effect in sophisticated ways. And there are lots and lots of examples of how artillery became much more coordinated with tanks and infantry, much more focused on defeating enemy positions rather than destroying them. That's an important distinction. The aim of artillery was no longer to blatter the enemy into destruction or acquiescence, but to use it to define the way in which the battlefield was structured. But that's really important. So you use fires to deny areas to the enemy, to deny their ability to bring up stores and ammunition, deny their ability to see what you're doing, to use artillery as a direct attack on morale. It's very interesting when we start the book by just describing some of the basic tactics used in the 100 Days battles in 1918 through the diaries of Duff Cooper. And they're brilliant diaries. And he inadvertently sort of describes a battle that we would all recognize today, with platoons being given platoon commanders just being given an objective 25 miles away and told just to find their best way of getting there with the support of artillery called in by telephone on Don 10 radio line, telephone line, and with the support of tanks and mobile artillery. And it's particularly impressive to see how quickly how far the army had moved in 1918 from 1916. And he describes the use of artillery in a really helpful way. They were attacking a position and they called in artillery just to keep the enemy's heads down. The enemy, expecting a long bombardment of several hours, went down into their very, very deep dugouts. One of the dramatic features, of course, of the Western Front was the Germans' propensity to burrow deep and survive. And of course, the bombardment was only for 5 minutes, by which time the advancing British, Australian and Canadians were in the forward trenches, and the Germans were way below and were just taken prisoners as they came out. That was a very significant feature of 1918. So a different way of using artillery. And of course, you use artillery to channel the enemy in ways that they would otherwise not want to operate. So there was, to answer your question, there was a mixture of systemic, i.e. policy-driven changes to learning, but there was also just the fact that everyone was learning on the job. If you wanted to survive the next fight, you did things differently the next time round. And all the memoirs of the First World War are replete with this imperative. So you can knock on the head the idea that actually the Allied armies after 1916 were lions led by donkeys. There were no donkeys. People were working very, very hard to save blood and treasure and to identify very sophisticated ways of solving the problem of this new battlefield, from new types of artillery, new types of using artillery, integrating everyone on the ground, which I've mentioned, but also including the air. And by 1918, the ground could operate or could communicate with the air. We had a whole bunch of SE-5 Beaufort aircraft that were equipped with radio transmitters, and they could radio in positions from the air to the ground, which is quite an extraordinary transformation when you consider how few years had been since Marconi invented this newfangled way of communicating across the airways. Only months before, aircraft would go up on reconnaissance, try to spot what the enemy were doing, have to fly back, land, send a pigeon or something similar, or ring up the troops on the ground and give them that information. That was all changing very, very quickly. So you had plans for 1919 that were really quite incredibly sophisticated. I don't think they would have necessarily worked. We had JFC Fuller's Plan 1919, which involved several thousand Mark V tanks and advancing like cavalry against German positions. I think that would have just created quite an easy target for lots of German artillery, frankly. I don't think that wasn't the answer, although JFC Fuller went to his grave believing that mass tank assaults, like as though they were mechanized cavalry, was the answer to warfare, and it never was. Wasn't then, it isn't now. But so transformation, yeah, you had a lot of people thinking about how to transform fighting, transform warfare. And there's a little bit of nugatory nonsense you see on social media and some of the forums on the internet about one army being better at this than others, and the French army coming up with the stormtrooper idea in 1917 and being first to the point of coming up with these with solutions to problems. Those arguments are nugatory. They're a waste of time. All armies were coming up with new solutions to these problems in very small places right across the line. And saying that the French invented blitzkrieg is just such a waste of air. It's just not worth doing. When the Germans, of course, first tried out their blitzkrieg idea with stormtroopers in March 1918, the famous Michael offensive against Amiens, of course, they realized within days that it would fail because they'd forgotten one fundamental thing, which was material sustainment. They couldn't sustain it. Simply attacking at a weak point with quite dramatic effect simply created a bulge in the line. And blitzkrieg as an idea was first presented then, but of course not in its full way. And the Germans learned that by 1940. Sustainment was fundamentally important. In the same way that sustainment became the leitmotif of Slim's operations in Burma in 1945, and indeed was fundamentally important to the advance of the 21st Army Group across Europe, aircraft supplying forward troops with supplies, combat supplies, to enable them to keep on going. And that was one of the lessons of 1918.
A great interview there with Robert. It highlights the difficulties in developing doctrine whilst you're trying to fight a world war. Not only do you need to develop doctrine that's going to enable you to win, you need to develop doctrine whilst technology is changing and the enemy is changing. This turns the simple process of doctrine development during peacetime into the wicked problem that we saw in the First World War. Next week we'll return to look at what happened in the interwar period and how those expensive lessons were forgotten.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.